Sometimes life leaves you with nothing but broken memories and a piece of land that seems worthless. That's exactly where Jedediah Cain found himself when he inherited his grandfather's old property in Montana Territory. All that remained was a crumbling treehouse wedged in an ancient hickory tree, rotting away like forgotten dreams. Most men would have walked away from such a sight, but Jed's faithful dog Boone had other ideas. The old mutt kept scratching and digging around the tree's roots like he was chasing ghosts. When Boone finally unearthed a rusted tin box, everything changed. Inside was a child's hand-drawn map and a locket with a woman's face Jed had never seen before. This simple discovery would lead him down a path of buried family secrets and stolen gold that had been hidden for over a century. But what really happened to the mysterious woman in that locket? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the canopy of towering pines as Jedediah Cain stood in the clearing where his grandfather's cabin once stood. Nothing remained but a stone chimney rising from a foundation of weathered logs like a monument to time's relentless march. The air carried the scent of pine needles and something deeper, the earthy smell of decades passing without human footsteps, disturbing the soil. Jed was a man carved from the mountains themselves. At 53, his face bore the lines of someone who'd spent more years squinting into wind and weather than sitting behind a desk. His beard, more salt than pepper now, framed a mouth that smiled easily but spoke sparingly. Standing 6 feet tall with the lean build of a man who'd never known an easy day, he carried himself with the quiet confidence that comes from surviving whatever the wilderness throws your way. Boone, his 7-year-old blue-tick coonhound, padded through the underbrush with the methodical patience of a dog who understood that some journeys couldn't be rushed. The hound's coat, a mottled blue-gray with patches of tan around his intelligent eyes, showed the scars of countless hunts through bramble and creek bed. More than a companion, Boone was Jed's anchor to the present when memories threatened to pull him too far into the past. The drive from Jed's cabin in the Bitterroot Valley had taken most of the morning, winding through mountain passes that seemed to grow narrower with each mile. He'd inherited this patch of Montana wilderness 3 months ago when his great-uncle Ezra passed at the age of 91. The old man had been the last link to the family's homesteading days, a cantankerous hermit who'd lived alone in these mountains for the better part of 40 years. Ezra's funeral had been sparsely attended, just Jed, the preacher, and Mrs. Henderson from the general store in the nearest town, some 20 miles down the mountain. The lawyer's office in Missoula had been even more somber when Jed learned he'd inherited land that hadn't seen cultivation in decades, along with a tax bill that made his jaw clench. "Property's been in your family since 1873, the lawyer had explained, sliding the deed across his mahogany desk. Your great-great-grandfather, Silas Cain, filed the original homestead claim. Of course, there's nothing much left up there now except wilderness and memories." Jed had driven up that first time, with the intention of surveying what could be salvaged and sold. The lumber might fetch something, and maybe a hunting outfitter would be interested in the water rights. He'd been thinking practically the way a man does when he's got his own mortgage to consider, and retirement still feeling like a luxury he couldn't afford. But the mountains had other plans. The first thing that caught his attention wasn't the ruined cabin or the overgrown fields where his ancestors had once coaxed corn and potatoes from reluctant soil. It was the treehouse, perched 15 feet, up in the arms of a massive hickory tree that must have been ancient when his great-great-grandfather first laid eyes on it. The structure defied easy description. Part treehouse, part hunting blind, it had been built with the kind of rough-hewn craftsmanship that spoke of practical necessity rather than architectural ambition. Weather-beaten planks formed walls that had warped and split over the decades, held together by rusted nails and what appeared to be stubborn determination. A rope ladder, now rotted through in several places, dangled uselessly from what had once been a trapdoor entrance. Moss covered the roof like a green blanket, and creeping vines had claimed the eastern wall, threading through gaps in the boards, with the persistence of nature reclaiming what man had borrowed. The whole structure listed slightly to one side, as if the great hickory had shifted its burden over the years, and the treehouse had simply adapted, the way old things do when they're too stubborn to fall. Jed had circled the tree that first day, hands in his pockets, trying to imagine who had built such a thing and why. The construction suggested someone with more enthusiasm than expertise. A father building a refuge for his children, perhaps, or a young man creating a hideaway where he could watch the world without being watched in return. Boone had taken an immediate interest in the tree's base, his nose working overtime as he paced back and forth along the root line. The dog's behavior struck Jed as odd. Boone was a practical animal, not given to chasing shadows or barking at nothing. When he focused on something, experience had taught Jed to pay attention. That first visit had lasted only a few hours. Jed had walked the property boundaries, noted the stream that ran clear and cold along the northern edge, and made mental calculations about timber value and hunting lease potential. But as he'd loaded Boone back into his pickup truck, he'd found himself glancing back at the treehouse with something that felt uncomfortably like regret. The second visit came a week later, ostensibly to take measurements and photographs for the real estate listing. But if Jed was honest with himself, and at 53 he'd learned the value of honesty, he'd come back because the place had gotten under his skin. There was something about the silence, broken only by wind through pine boughs and the distant call of a red-tailed hawk, that made him feel more settled than he had in months. His life in the valley had grown predictable in ways that both comforted and constrained him. 22 years working for the Forest Service, first as a ranger, then as a district supervisor, had given him a steady paycheck and a pension he could count on. His cabin outside Hamilton was paid for, and his needs were simple: coffee in the morning, a good book in the evening, and Boone's companionship through it all. But lately, Jed had found himself wondering if predictable was the same thing as satisfied. His ex-wife Sarah had remarried 2 years ago, moved to Oregon with her new husband, and seemed genuinely happy in a way that made him glad for her, and slightly envious at the same time. They'd divorced amicably 8 years earlier, acknowledging that they'd grown into different people who wanted different things from life. No children had come from their marriage. A disappointment that had slowly transformed into acceptance, then something approaching relief. His few remaining friends were scattered across the state, busy with their own families and careers. The younger rangers looked at him with the polite deference reserved for someone they considered past his prime, and the older ones had mostly retired to Arizona or Florida, seeking warmth and golf courses instead of mountain air and solitude. Standing in the clearing where his great-great-grandfather had once built a life from nothing but determination and timber, Jed felt the weight of continuity. The Cain family had worked this land, raised children here, buried their dead in the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the valley. They'd survived harsh winters and grasshopper plagues, watched the territory become a state, and adapted to changes that would have broken lesser people. Now it fell to him to decide what came next. The practical voice in his head, the one that sounded suspiciously like his father, insisted he should sell quickly and invest the proceeds sensibly. Property taxes and maintenance costs would eat away at any sentimental value, and what was the point of holding on to land he'd never use? But another voice, quieter but more insistent, whispered about roots and legacy, about the satisfaction that comes from tending something larger than yourself. That voice grew stronger each time he looked at the treehouse and imagined the hands that had built it, the dreams that had shaped it, and the stories it might tell if old wood could speak. On his third visit, Jed had brought a thermos of coffee and a folding chair, telling himself he was simply taking time to think through his options. He'd positioned the chair where he could see both the ruined cabin site and the treehouse, sipping coffee that tasted better in the mountain air than it ever did at home. Boone had resumed his investigation of the hickory's roots, his behavior growing more focused with each visit. The dog would pace a tight circle around the tree's base, nose to the ground, occasionally pausing to scratch at the earth with the kind of deliberate intensity that made Jed set down his coffee and pay attention. "What is it, old boy?" he'd asked. But Boone had simply looked at him with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to say, "You'll figure it out when you're ready." That afternoon, as shadows began to lengthen across the clearing, Jed had made a decision that surprised him. Instead of listing the property, he'd drive back to town and talk to contractors about what it would take to make the old place habitable again. Not as a full-time residence, he wasn't ready for that kind of isolation, but as a retreat, a place where he could come to remember what silence sounded like and what it felt like to be part of something larger than his daily routine. The decision had felt right in a way that most of his choices didn't anymore. Not practical, perhaps, but right in the deeper sense that comes from the heart rather than the head. Now, standing in the morning light with the rusted tin box tucked under his arm, Jed understood that his instinct had been sound. The mountains had been trying to tell him something, and Boone had been the messenger, patient and persistent as only a good dog could be. He looked up at the treehouse, its weathered boards catching the early sunlight, and felt a stirring of anticipation that he hadn't experienced since he was young enough to believe that every day might bring an adventure worth remembering. Whatever secrets this place held, whatever stories the box might reveal, Jed was finally ready to listen. Jed carried the tin box to his folding chair and set it carefully on the ground beside him. The metal was pitted with rust and age, its corners rounded by decades of weather and neglect. A simple hasp held the lid closed, secured by what remained of a small brass padlock that had long since surrendered to corrosion. Boone settled at his feet, panting lightly from his morning excavation, his tail thumping against the pine needles in a steady rhythm that spoke of satisfaction at a job well done. The dog's eyes remained fixed on the box, as if he understood its importance in ways that Jed was only beginning to grasp. The padlock crumbled at the first touch, its brass innards having given up their hold on security sometime during the Carter administration. The hasp opened with a protest of rusted metal against metal, and Jed felt his heart quicken as he lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in what had once been oiled cloth but now resembled old leather, lay two items that would change everything he thought. He knew about his family's history. The first was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and soft as fabric from years of moisture and drying. When Jed unfolded it carefully, he found himself looking at a hand-drawn map executed in the careful strokes of someone who'd learned penmanship when such things mattered. The lines were drawn in faded brown ink, or perhaps blood, given the wilderness setting, and showed a rough approximation of the local terrain. The map depicted the clearing where he now sat, marked with a small square that must represent the original cabin. A winding line indicated the creek that still ran along the northern boundary, and various landmarks were noted with the kind of abbreviated descriptions that made sense to the mapmaker, but left Jed puzzling over their meaning. 3 Sisters, Rock, Devil's Backbone Ridge, Widow's Creek Crossing, names that spoke of intimate familiarity with the landscape. But it was the markings that caught his attention. Several locations were marked with small X's, each accompanied by numbers that appeared to be distances or measurements. At the bottom of the map, in the same careful hand, someone had written, "For my beloved Clara, the truth of what happened must not die with me. Find courage in knowing that justice, though delayed, is not denied. Your devoted Thomas, July 1873. The second item was a silver locket, tarnished black, but still intact. The chain had long since given way to time, but the locket itself opened at Jed's gentle pressure to reveal a tintype photograph of a young woman. Her face was serious, as was customary for photographs of that era, but her eyes held a warmth that transcended the formal pose. She wore her dark hair in the severe style of the 1870s, parted in the middle and pulled back, but nothing could diminish the quiet beauty that gazed out from the small oval frame dot on the reverse side of the photograph in the same hand as the map's inscription. Someone had written, "Clara Whitmore Cain, beloved wife and mother, taken too soon but never forgotten. Thomas and little Samuel, 1872. Jed stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he knew of his family history. According to the family Bible that had been passed down through the generations, the same Bible that now sat on the mantel in his cabin, his great-great-grandfather Silas Cain had been married to a woman named Rebecca. Their son, Samuel, had been Jed's great-grandfather Dot, but this photograph clearly identified a Clara Whitmore Cain, and the date preceded his great-great-grandfather's known arrival in Montana Territory by a full year. A chill ran down Jed's spine that had nothing to do with the mountain air. He was looking at evidence of a woman who had somehow been erased from his family's recorded history, a woman whose existence challenged everything he thought he knew about his bloodline. Boone whined softly and nudged Jed's leg with his muzzle, sensing his master's distress. Jed reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears, taking comfort in the simple reality of warm fur and unconditional loyalty, while his mind wrestled with the implications of what he'd discovered. The map bore today's date, July 15th, though separated by exactly 150 years. Thomas had hidden this box on the anniversary of Clara's death, or perhaps her disappearance. The careful way he'd preserved both the map and the photograph suggested someone who believed the truth would eventually surface, that someone would care enough to follow the trail he'd left behind. That someone, apparently, was Jed. He studied the map more carefully, trying to match the hand-drawn landmarks with the terrain he knew. The creek was easy enough to identify, and he could make out the ridgeline that formed the eastern boundary of the property. Three Sisters Rock rang a bell. He remembered his great-uncle Ezra mentioning a rock formation by that name, though Jed had never ventured far enough into the backcountry to see it himself. The X's on the map appeared to mark a trail leading from the clearing into the mountains, ending at what looked like a cave or overhang marked with the words, "Where Truth Sleeps." The distances were noted in paces, the kind of rough measurement a man would use when he didn't have surveying equipment, but needed to record a path for someone else to follow. A's. Jed sat in the morning silence, piecing together the fragments of a mystery that had waited more than a century for someone to care enough to solve it. He felt the first stirrings of something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with duty or obligation, and everything to do with curiosity and the pull of family bonds that transcended death. Clara Whitmore Cain gazed up at him from the photograph, her eyes holding secrets that someone had died trying to preserve. Whatever had happened to her, whatever truth Thomas had been so determined to record, it had been important enough to hide carefully and document precisely. The practical part of Jed's mind suggested he should take his discovery to the County Historical Society, or perhaps the university. Trained researchers could probably make sense of the map and the photograph more efficiently than a retired forest ranger with too much time on his hands. But a stronger impulse argued for keeping the mystery close, at least for now. This was family business after all. Clara Cain, for she was a Cain, whatever else she might have been, had been waiting 150 years for someone to follow the trail that Thomas had laid out. She deserved better than to become a footnote in someone else's research paper or a curiosity for amateur historians to debate over coffee. She deserved the truth, whatever that might be. Jed closed the locket carefully and refolded the map, wrapping both items in what remained of the oiled cloth before returning them to the tin box. The container felt heavier now, weighted with more than rust and age. It carried the hopes of a man who died believing that someone would eventually care enough to finish what he'd started. As he stood and brushed pine needles from his jeans, Jed felt Boone press against his leg. The dog looked up at him with an expression that seemed almost approving, as if he'd known all along that this moment would come, and was satisfied that his human had finally caught up with the program. "Well, old boy," Jed said quietly, "looks like we've got ourselves a mystery to solve." The words hung in the mountain air, and somewhere in the distance a jay called once, sharp and clear, as if nature itself was acknowledging that the game was finally afoot. For the first time in months, Jed felt truly awake. The drive back to Hamilton took longer than usual, not because of road conditions, but because Jed's mind kept drifting from the winding mountain highway to the tin box sitting on his passenger seat. Every few miles, he'd glance over at it, half expecting it to have vanished like some fever dream brought on by too much mountain air and solitude. Boone rode in his customary position, head hanging out the rear window, ears flapping in the wind. But even the dog seemed more alert than usual, occasionally turning to look at the tin box, as if he too understood they were carrying something significant. By the time Jed pulled into his driveway, the afternoon sun was painting the Bitterroot, mountains in shades of gold and purple. His cabin, a modest two-bedroom structure he'd built himself over 3 summers, sat on 5 acres of meadow and pine, far enough from town to ensure privacy, but close enough to civilization that he didn't have to haul supplies in by pack mule. Inside, Jed set the tin box on his kitchen table and made coffee, going through the familiar ritual while his thoughts churned. The family Bible sat on his mantel, its leather binding cracked with age and handling. He'd inherited it from his father, who'd received it from his father before him, back through the generations to the original Silas Cain. With his coffee mug in hand, Jed retrieved the Bible and carried it back to the kitchen table. The family genealogy was recorded in the front pages, written in various hands as births, marriages and deaths were dutifully noted over the decades. His finger traced down the entries until he found what he was looking for. Silas Cain, born 1845, married Rebecca Hartwell, 1874, arrived Montana Territory, 1874. Children, Samuel B., 1875, Martha B., 1877, Joseph B., 1880. The dates were clear and had never been questioned. Silas had arrived in Montana Territory in 1874, married Rebecca the same year, and their first child Samuel had been born in 1875. It was a tidy progression that accounted for Jed's lineage back to the homesteading generation. But Thomas's map was dated July 1873, a full year before Silas was supposed to have arrived in Montana, and the inscription referred to Little Samuel, as if the boy already existed in 1872, 3 years before his recorded birth. Jed opened the tin box again and examined the photograph more closely. In the bottom corner, barely visible in the faded image, he could make out what appeared to be a child's foot and the hem of a small dress or gown. Someone else had been in the photograph originally, but the tintype had been carefully cropped to focus on Clara's face. Little Samuel. Perhaps. The implications were troubling. If Thomas's map and the photograph were genuine, and Jed had no reason to doubt their authenticity, then the family history he'd grown up believing was incomplete at best, deliberately falsified at worst. He thought about his great-uncle Ezra, the family's unofficial historian and the last keeper of the old stories. Ezra had lived alone in the mountains for 40 years, rarely coming to town, except for supplies, and never volunteering information about the family's early days. Jed had always assumed the old man's reticence came from natural shyness and a hermit's discomfort with social interaction. Now, he wondered if Ezra had been keeping secrets. The afternoon light was fading when Jed heard a vehicle pulling into his driveway. Through the kitchen window, he saw Martha Thornfield's dusty Subaru wagon coming to a stop beside his pickup. Martha ran the local historical society and had been trying to get Jed to donate family artifacts to their collection for the better part of a decade. She was a handsome woman in her late 40s, divorced like himself, with prematurely grey hair that she wore pulled back in a practical ponytail, and laugh lines that spoke of someone who found genuine joy in dusty documents and forgotten stories. They'd known each other since high school, had dated briefly after his divorce, and had settled into the comfortable friendship that sometimes develops between people who recognize they're better as friends than lovers. "Jed?" Martha called from his front porch. "Your truck's here, but you're not answering your phone." "Come on in," he called back, hastily closing the family Bible and moving the tin box to a kitchen counter where it wouldn't be immediately visible. Martha entered with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to being welcome wherever she went. She was carrying a manila folder and wore the slightly excited expression that Jed recognized as her "I've discovered something interesting" look. "I've been trying to reach you all day," she said, settling into one of his kitchen chairs without invitation. "I was going through some old territorial records that came in from the state archives, and I found something about your family that you might find interesting." Jed poured her coffee and tried to keep his expression neutral. "Oh? What kind of something?" Martha opened her folder and pulled out a photocopied document. A marriage certificate from 1872. Silas Cain to Clara Whitmore, witnessed by Thomas Hartwell and Mary Whitmore. The ceremony was performed by a traveling preacher named Josiah Matthews. Jed's coffee mug stopped halfway to his mouth. "Clara Whitmore. You've heard the name?" Martha's eyebrows rose with interest. "That surprises me. I couldn't find any mention of her in the family records I've seen. According to this certificate, she was your great-great-grandmother, not Rebecca Hartwell." Jed set down his mug carefully, his mind racing. The marriage certificate confirmed what Thomas's map had suggested. Clara Whitmore had been a Cain, married to Silas 2 years earlier than the family Bible recorded. "There's more," Martha continued, pulling out another document, a birth certificate. For Samuel Cain, born March 15, 1873, mother listed as Clara Whitmore Cain, father as Silas Cain. The pieces were starting to form a picture, but it was a picture that raised more questions than it answered. If Clara had been Silas's first wife, what had happened to her? And why had all record of her existence been removed from the family history? "Where did these records come from?" Jed asked. "That's the interesting part. They were filed in Virginia City, the territorial capital at the time, but they were never transferred to the local records when the county was established. I only found them because the state is digitizing all the old territorial documents, and my name is on a list to receive notifications about local families." Martha leaned forward, her historian's instincts clearly engaged. "Jed, this suggests your family history might be more complicated than you've been told. Clara Whitmore Cain seems to have disappeared from the record entirely after 1873. No death certificate, no divorce decree, nothing. It's as if she simply vanished." Through the kitchen window, Jed could see Boone lying on the front porch, his head raised as if listening to their conversation. The dog's positioning reminded him of the way Boone had behaved at the tree, alert and expectant, as if waiting for humans to catch up with something he already understood. "Martha," Jed said slowly, "what would you say if I told you I might have found some additional information about Clara Whitmore?" Her eyes lit up with the fervor that made her such a good historian. "I'd say I'm very interested in seeing it." Jed studied Martha's face for a long moment, weighing trust against caution. In the years since his divorce, he'd grown accustomed to keeping his own counsel, sharing personal matters sparingly and only after careful consideration. But the documents Martha had brought changed the equation. She'd already proven that Clara Whitmore existed in the official record, which meant she might be the key to understanding what had happened to his forgotten great-great-grandmother. "Let me show you something," he said finally, Retrieving the tin box from the counter, Martha, quote, "S eyes widened as Jed carefully removed the locket and the map, setting them on the kitchen table beside her manila folder. Her historian's training took over immediately, and she leaned forward, without touching either artifact, studying them with the reverent attention she might give a newly discovered Civil War diary. "Where did you find these?" she asked, her voice dropping to the whisper people instinctively use in the presence of genuine antiquity. "Boone dug up the box this morning, buried under the big hickory where the treehouse sits." Jed opened the locket carefully, revealing Clara's photograph. "The inscription on the back matches your marriage certificate. Clara Whitmore Cain, 1872. Martha's intake of breath was audible. "Jed, this is extraordinary. Look at the craftsmanship on this locket. That's solid silver, probably made by a skilled jeweler. And this photograph is a tintype, which means it would have been expensive to commission in 1872, especially out here in the territories." She turned her attention to the map, her fingers hovering over the faded ink without quite touching the paper. "Thomas, that would be Thomas Hartwell, the witness on the marriage certificate. He must have drawn this. The handwriting matches what I've seen on other territorial documents from that period. You think it's genuine?" "I have no doubt it's genuine. The question is what story it's trying to tell." Martha pulled a magnifying glass from her folder and studied the map more closely. "These landmarks, Three Sisters Rock, Devil's Backbone Ridge, I've seen those names in other documents from the 1870s. They were well-known reference points for travelers and settlers in this area." Jed poured himself more coffee, his mind working through the implications. "So we have Clara Whitmore marrying Silas in 1872, giving birth to Samuel in 1873, and then Thomas creating this map in July 1873 after something happened to her. Something significant enough that he felt compelled to hide evidence and draw a treasure map. A treasure map that's waited 150 years for someone to follow it," Martha added. "The question is whether you're prepared to do that." Before Jed could answer, Boone began barking outside, his deep bay carrying the particular note that meant someone was approaching. Through the window, Jed saw an unfamiliar pickup truck pulling into his driveway, its driver obscured by the gathering dusk. The truck was a newer model, Ford, clean and well-maintained in the way that suggested either meticulous care or recent purchase. It parked beside Martha's Subaru, and a man in his 60s climbed out, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints reminded him daily of his age. Jed didn't recognize the visitor, but something about the man's bearing, the straight shoulders, the measured pace, the way he paused to assess his surroundings before approaching the house, suggested military or law enforcement background. "Expecting someone?" Martha asked. "No." Jed closed the locket and folded the map, returning. "Boat to the tin box. Stay here." He stepped onto his front porch, Boone taking position beside him with the alert stance of a dog, prepared to defend his territory if necessary. The stranger approached with his hands visible, a gesture of peacekeeping that confirmed Jed's impression of professional training. "Mr. Cain," the man called when he was still several yards away, "my name is Robert Whitmore. I believe we need to talk." The surname hit Jed like a physical blow. Whitmore, Clara's maiden name. He felt Martha's presence behind him as she joined him on the porch, her historian's curiosity apparently overriding any concern for privacy. "Robert Whitmore," the man repeated, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. "I'm Clara Whitmore's great-great-nephew. I've been looking for information about my family for the better part of 30 years, and today I received a phone call that changed everything." "What kind of phone call?" Jed asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "From the Montana State Archives. A researcher there has been digitizing old territorial records, and she noticed that 2 separate requests had been made in the past week for documents relating to Clara Whitmore Cain, one from the Ravalli County Historical Society," he nodded toward Martha, and one from a private researcher I hired last month. Robert reached into his jacket pocket slowly, producing a leather portfolio. Mr. Cain, I have reason to believe that Clara Whitmore was murdered in July of 1873, and that her death was covered up to protect someone powerful enough to rewrite the territorial records. The evening air suddenly felt thinner, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Jed exchanged glances with Martha, seeing his own shock reflected in her face. "You'd better come inside," Jed said. They gathered around the kitchen table, the tin box sitting in the center like a silent witness to secrets that had been buried for a century and a half. Robert Whitmore opened his portfolio and spread out documents that included genealogical charts, photocopied newspaper clippings, and what appeared to be private correspondence. "My family has passed down stories for 5 generations," Robert began. "Stories about Clara, the beautiful young woman who married a homesteader and disappeared without a trace. My great-great-grandfather was Mary Whitmore, Clara's younger sister. She witnessed the marriage and was present when Clara gave birth to Samuel." He pulled out a faded daguerreotype showing 2 young women standing beside a wooden fence. Clara and Mary, taken in 1871. Mary kept this photograph her entire life and passed it down with a story that never varied, no matter how many times she told it. "What story?" Martha asked. Robert Quote's expression darkened. "That Clara discovered something she wasn't supposed to know. Something about stolen gold and territorial officials who were willing to kill to keep their secret. Mary claimed that Clara was murdered by men who worked for the territorial government, and that her death was covered up because she'd threatened to expose a robbery that went all the way to the governor's office." Jed felt the weight of the tin box's contents with new understanding. Thomas's map wasn't just a record of Clara's final resting place. It was evidence of a crime that powerful men had believed they'd buried forever. "Mr. Whitmore," he said quietly, "I think it's time we compared notes." The 3 of them worked by lamplight until well past midnight, spreading documents across Jed's kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle that had been scattered across 150 years of deliberate forgetting. What emerged was a story that none of them could have imagined individually, but which made terrible sense when their separate discoveries were combined. Robert Quote's family oral history provided the framework. According to Mary Whitmore's account, passed down through 5 generations with the consistency that comes from profound trauma, Clara had stumbled upon evidence of a gold robbery in the summer of 1873. The crime involved territorial officials who had intercepted a shipment meant for the federal mint in Helena, a theft that would have been worth hundreds of thousands of dollars in today's money. Martha Quote's archival research filled in the official background. The territorial government in 1873 was notoriously corrupt, with appointed officials more interested in personal enrichment than effective governance. Several investigations by federal authorities had been stonewalled or mysteriously abandoned, suggesting protection at the highest levels. Jed Quote's tin box provided the physical evidence that connected the story to a specific location and time frame. Thomas Hartwell's map wasn't just a record of Clara's burial site. It was a guide to hidden evidence that could expose the entire conspiracy. "Look at this," Martha said, pointing to a newspaper clipping from Robert's collection. The headline read, "Territorial Secretary resigns amid health concerns." The date was August 15th, 1873, exactly 1 month after Thomas had hidden his tin box. "That's James Morrison," Robert explained. "According to family stories, he was one of the men involved in the gold theft." Mary claimed that Clara had discovered Morrison was using territorial government wagons to transport stolen gold to a buyer in California. Jed studied Thomas's map again, noting the careful way the landmarks were drawn. Thomas knew exactly where he was going when he made this map. These aren't rough estimates, they're precise measurements. He'd walked this route before, maybe with Clara, Martha suggested. If she'd discovered where they were hiding the gold, she might have taken Thomas to see it. As her brother-in-law and the witness to her marriage, he would have been someone she trusted. The implications were chilling. Clara hadn't just stumbled upon evidence of corruption, she'd found the actual hiding place where stolen federal gold was being stored before shipment to buyers. In an era when territorial law enforcement was either bought or intimidated, she would have had no one to turn to, except family. Robert pulled out another document. This one, a handwritten letter that had been carefully preserved between sheets of acid-free paper. This is from Mary to her cousin in Ohio, written in 1875. She was afraid to stay in Montana after Clara's death, so she moved east, but she kept trying to find out what had really happened. The letter, written in the careful script of someone unaccustomed to extensive correspondence, contained a passage that made all three of them pause. I cannot forget what Clara told me the night before she died. She said she had found where they kept the stolen gold, hidden in a place so remote that no honest man would think to look. She had taken Thomas there to witness what she had seen, and they had made a map together so that someday, when it was safe, the truth could come to light. She was planning to confront Silas about what she had learned, to demand that he help her report the theft to federal authorities. I tried to warn her that such men would not hesitate to kill to protect their secret, but Clara always believed that right would triumph over wrong. It was her greatest strength, and I fear the cause of her death. The letter provided the missing piece of the puzzle. Clara hadn't just discovered the gold theft. She had planned to expose it, and she had evidence that could have brought down the entire territorial administration. More importantly, she had intended to involve Silas in her crusade for justice. But Silas didn't help her, Jed said quietly. If he had, there would be some record of it. Instead, he let her die and then rewrote the family history to erase her existence. Martha shook her head. We don't know that Silas was complicit. Maybe Clara never got the chance to tell him what she'd discovered, or maybe she did, and something happened to both of them. Robert had been studying Thomas's map with a magnifying glass, comparing it to modern topographical charts he'd pulled up on his phone. I think I can identify most of these landmarks. Three Sisters Rock is still there. It's about 8 miles. Northeast of your property, Jed. Devil's Backbone Ridge runs along the eastern slope of Mount Sentinel. If we follow this route, we should be able to find whatever Clara and Thomas discovered. The prospect of actually following the 150-year-old map sent a thrill of anticipation through Jed that he hadn't felt since childhood. But it was tempered by a growing awareness that they might not be the only ones interested in Clara Whitmore's secret. Robert, you said you hired a private researcher last month. What exactly did you ask him to find? Robert's expression grew troubled. Everything I could about Clara's disappearance and death. Marriage records, land deeds, newspaper accounts, territorial correspondence, anything that might shed light on what happened to her. And this researcher has been filing requests with the state archives. Yes, I gave him broad authorization to access any documents related to the Whitmore or Cain families in Montana Territory between 1870 and 1880. Martha leaned back in her chair, her historian's instincts clearly troubled. That's a lot of attention focused on a 150-year-old mystery. If someone wanted to keep Clara's story buried, all this sudden research activity might have attracted unwanted notice. As if summoned by her words, Boone began barking again outside, his deep bay cutting through the mountain silence. But this time, his bark carried a different note, not the alert attention of earlier, but the aggressive warning that meant he perceived a genuine threat. Jed moved to the window and peered out into the darkness beyond his porch light. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Then, as his eyes adjusted, he caught a glimpse of movement among the pine trees that bordered his property. A shadow that seemed too purposeful to be wildlife, too large to be anything but human. Turn off the lights, he said quietly. Martha, and Robert moved quickly to comply, plunging the kitchen into darkness. In the sudden quiet, they could hear Boone's continued barking, and beneath it the faint sound of an engine running somewhere in the darkness beyond Jed's driveway. Someone was watching the house, and they were taking care not to be seen. They waited in the darkness for 20 minutes, listening to Boone's intermittent barking and the distant sound of the engine that never seemed to move closer or farther away. Finally, the engine noise faded entirely, and Boone settled into the watchful silence that meant the immediate threat had passed. Jed turned on a single lamp, keeping the curtains drawn. "Robert, this private researcher you hired, what's his name, and how did you find him?" "David Kellerman. He advertises genealogical services online, specializes in Western territorial records. His website showed good credentials, and he had testimonials from other clients who'd used his services for family history research." Martha frowned. "I've never heard of him, and I know most of the reputable researchers who work with Montana territorial documents. What did he tell you he'd found so far?" Robert pulled out his phone and scrolled through his emails. "Not much, actually. He said the territorial records were incomplete and that it might take months to piece together Clara's story. But he kept asking for more money, claiming he needed to travel to various archives and pay for document reproduction." "How much have you paid him?" Jed asked. "About $3,000 over the past month. I know it sounds like a lot, but he convinced me that thorough historical research was expensive and time-consuming." Jed and Martha exchanged glances. In the light of what they'd discovered in a single evening, $3,000 for essentially no useful information suggested either incompetence or deliberate misdirection. "Robert," Martha said gently, "I think you may have been scammed. The documents I found today took me about 4 hours and cost nothing but a phone call to request digital copies from the state archives." Robert's face reddened with embarrassment and growing anger. "You're saying this Kellerman has been stringing me along. I'm saying someone's been taking your money and feeding you false information about how difficult this research should be. The question is whether that's simple fraud or something more complicated." Jed was thinking about timing and coincidences. Robert had hired Kellerman a month ago, which meant the researcher had been filing requests with various archives for weeks before Martha's inquiry had triggered the state archivist's call. If someone wanted to monitor research into Clara Whitmore's disappearance, a fake genealogical service would be an effective way to do it. "Robert, do you have Kellerman's business address?" "Just a P.O. box in Billings. I tried calling his office number once, but it went to voicemail and he always called me back from different numbers." Martha pulled out her laptop and began typing. "Let me see what I can find about David Kellerman, genealogical researcher." After a few minutes of searching, she looked up with a troubled expression. "There are references to his name on various genealogy forums, but they're all recent, nothing older than 6 months. His website was registered 3 months ago through a privacy service that hides the actual owner's information. So, he's probably not a real researcher," Jed concluded. "Or he's a real researcher working for someone who doesn't want their interest in Clara Whitmore to be obvious," Martha replied. "Think about it. If you wanted to monitor anyone looking into a 150-year-old murder, what better way than to pose as the expert they'd hire to do the research?" The implications were disturbing. If Martha was right, then Robert's innocent desire to learn about his family history had been manipulated by someone with a vested interest in controlling information about Clara's death. And that same someone now knew that Robert had made contact with other researchers, which could explain the watchers outside Jed's house. "We need to assume that whoever is behind this knows everything Robert has told Kellerman," Jed said. "That includes Robert's suspicions about Clara being murdered, his family's oral history, and probably the fact that he's now in contact with us." Robert looked stricken. "I'm sorry. I had no idea I was putting you in danger." "You couldn't have known," Martha assured him, "but we need to be careful how we proceed. If there really is stolen gold still hidden somewhere in these mountains, and if powerful people have spent 150 years covering up Clara's murder, they won't hesitate to protect their secret now. Jed studied Thomas's map again, noting the careful way the route was laid out. The trail led from the homestead site through increasingly remote terrain, ending at what appeared to be a natural cave or rock shelter. If Clara and Thomas had hidden evidence there, it might still be intact after all these years. "I think we have three choices," he said. "We can turn everything over to law enforcement and let them handle it. We can forget the whole thing and hope these people lose interest in us. Or we can follow Thomas's map and find out what Clara died trying to expose." "What do you think law enforcement would do with a 150-year-old murder case?" Martha asked. "Probably file it away and forget about it. There's no statute of limitations on murder, but there's also no realistic chance of prosecuting anyone for a crime committed in 1873. And if we just drop it..." Jed thought about Clara's photograph, the serious young woman whose story had been deliberately erased from history. "Then Clara Whitmore stays forgotten, and whoever killed her wins." Robert had been listening quietly, but now he spoke with quiet determination. "My family has been telling Clara's story for 5 generations, passing it down even when there was no proof and no hope of justice. I can't be the one who decides to stop telling it." Martha nodded slowly. "From a historical perspective, this could be one of the most significant discoveries about territorial-era corruption ever documented. If there really is physical evidence hidden in those mountains, it could rewrite what we know about Montana's early government." Jed looked at both of them, seeing his own resolve reflected in their faces. They were all old enough to understand the risks, experienced enough to know that some secrets were protected by dangerous people, and stubborn enough to pursue the truth anyway. "Then we follow the map," he said. "But we do it smart. We tell someone trustworthy where we're going and when we expect to be back. We go prepared for trouble, and we assume that someone is watching us every step of the way." Outside, Boone had settled into the patient vigilance that meant he'd accepted guard duty for the night. The old hound understood, better than his human companions, that some hunts required more than one day to complete. The question was whether they would live long enough to finish what Clara and Thomas had started 150 years ago. They met at dawn. At Jed's property, the morning mist still clinging to the valley floor like nature's own attempt at concealment. Robert had arrived first, his pickup truck loaded with camping gear and enough supplies for several days in the backcountry. Martha followed 20 minutes later, carrying a backpack that clinked with the tools of her trade. GPS units, cameras, measuring devices, and evidence bags. Jed had spent the night preparing, checking his own gear and studying topographical maps by flashlight. More importantly, he'd written a detailed letter explaining their plan and left it with his neighbor Jim Hawkins, along with instructions to contact the sheriff if they weren't back within 3 days. The treehouse looked different in the early morning light, less mysterious and more melancholy, like an old man who'd been keeping secrets for too long. Boone investigated the area where he'd found the tin box, his nose working methodically over ground that had already yielded its primary treasure. "Before we start," Martha said, "I need to show you something I found last night after I got home." She pulled out her laptop and opened a folder filled with scanned documents. "I couldn't sleep, so I kept digging through the state archives. I found this in the territorial governor's correspondence files." The document was a letter dated August 20, 1873, written in the formal language of official territorial business. But its content made all 3 of them pause. "Governor Potts, the unfortunate incident involving the Cain woman has been resolved permanently. All witnesses have been relocated or otherwise silenced. The merchandise remains secure at the designated location pending transfer to our California associates. Recommend continued vigilance regarding any federal investigations into territorial transportation contracts." The new records have been filed, replacing all previous documentation. Your most obedient servant, J. Morrison. James Morrison, Robert breathed. The territorial secretary who resigned for health reasons. This is a smoking gun, Martha said. Written proof that Clara was murdered and that territorial officials were involved in stealing federal gold. But there's more. She opened another document, this one a shipping manifest from a freight company in Virginia City. 3 days after Clara's death, a wagon train left Virginia City bound for California. The cargo was listed as mining equipment and territorial supplies, but the weight recorded suggests they were carrying something much heavier than equipment. Jed studied the manifest, noting the careful way the cargo had been described. Gold is heavy. If they were shipping stolen federal gold to buyers in California, they'd need to disguise it as legitimate freight. And they'd need a remote place to store it while they arranged the sale, Robert added. Somewhere like the location Clara discovered. They shouldered their packs and began following Thomas's map, using GPS coordinates that Martha had calculated, by comparing the hand-drawn landmarks to modern topographical surveys. The trail led northeast from the homestead site, following what had once been a game path but was now barely visible after 150 years of neglect. Boone ranged ahead, his nose to the ground, as if following a scent trail that only he could detect. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the sounds of a wilderness that had changed little since Clara and Thomas had walked this same route in 1873. They climbed steadily for 2 hours, following ridgelines and creek beds that matched Thomas's careful notations. The Three Sisters rock formation appeared exactly where the map indicated. 3 granite pillars rising from a meadow like ancient monuments to forgotten gods. We're on the right track, Martha confirmed, checking her GPS against the map. According to Thomas's measurements, we should reach Devil's Backbone Ridge in another hour. But as they approached the ridge, Boone's behavior changed. The dog stopped. Abruptly, his hackles rising as he stared into the forest ahead. His low growl carried a warning that made all 3 humans freeze. "What is it, boy?" Jed whispered. Boone quote-s answer came in the form of a man stepping out from behind a large pine tree, a rifle held casually but ready in his hands. He was followed by 2 others, all dressed in hunting camouflage and moving with the coordinated precision of professionals. "That's far enough," the lead man called. He was in his 40s, lean and hard-faced, with the kind of pale eyes that suggested he'd seen things that had burned out most of his capacity for mercy. "You folks are trespassing on private property. According to my GPS, we're on national forest land," Martha replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "According to my employer, you're exactly where you shouldn't be." The man's smile held no warmth. "Now, I'm going to need you to hand over that tin box and any documents you found relating to certain historical events." Jed felt his blood turn cold. These weren't random hunters or territorial guards. They were professionals who knew exactly why the 3 researchers were in these mountains and what they hoped to find. "What tin box?" Robert asked, attempting to buy time. "The one your friend here dug up yesterday morning," the second man replied. He was younger than the leader, with the nervous energy of someone eager to prove his worth. "Did you really think we weren't watching?" Martha stepped forward slightly, placing herself between the armed men and her companions. "Who sent you? Who's paying you to protect a 150-year-old secret?" The lead man's expression grew amused. "Lady, you'd be surprised how many secrets are worth protecting, no matter how old they are. Some families have been guarding certain information for generations, and they're not about to let a bunch of amateur historians ruin a good thing." "Families?" Jed asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. "The gold your ancestor found wasn't the only thing that got buried in 1873, the leader explained. "When Clara Whitmore started asking the wrong questions, she threatened more than just a territorial corruption scheme. She threatened family legacies that go back 5 generations. Robert's face had gone pale. You're saying some of the territorial officials had descendants who are still protecting their ancestors' crimes. I'm saying some of those territorial officials had descendants who built very successful businesses and political careers on the foundation of that stolen gold. And they're not about to let that foundation crumble because some old lady's great-great-nephew decided to play detective. The third man, who had remained silent until now, suddenly spoke. Movement on the south. Ridge, looks like more company. Through the trees, Jed could see additional figures moving toward their position. But these newcomers weren't moving with the same coordinated precision as the three men holding them at gunpoint. They were moving like people trying to remain unseen while getting closer. The lead gunman cursed under his breath. This was supposed to be a simple recovery operation. Now we've got half the county hiking around these mountains. What do you want us to do? The younger man asked. Before the leader could answer, a rifle shot cracked through the morning air, the bullet striking a tree 6 inches from the younger gunman's head. All three armed men spun toward the sound, their weapons searching for targets among the pine trees and granite outcroppings. "Federal agents!" a voice called from the forest. "Drop your weapons and step away from the civilians!" The leader's face twisted with rage and something that looked like panic. Whatever plan he'd been following was clearly falling apart, and Jed could see him calculating whether to surrender or fight. "This is what happens when amateurs get involved," he snarled, raising his rifle toward Martha. "Too many people asking too many questions." But before he could fire, Boone launched himself from where he'd been crouched behind a fallen log, 60 pounds of loyal hound, hitting the gunman's center mass and sending him tumbling backward into the underbrush. In the chaos that followed, with federal agents emerging from concealment and the remaining gunman trying to decide whether to fight or flee, one truth became crystal clear. The secret that had been buried with Clara Whitmore was worth far more than stolen territorial gold, and far more dangerous than any of them had imagined. The gunfight lasted less than 3 minutes, but in the aftermath, as federal agents secured the scene and tended to wounded mercenaries, Jed found himself sitting on a fallen log, trying to process how quickly his simple inheritance had transformed into a federal investigation. Special Agent Sarah Chen was a compact woman in her late 30s who moved with the efficient authority of someone accustomed to taking charge of complicated situations. She'd arrived with a team of 6 agents, all armed and clearly prepared for exactly the kind of confrontation that had just occurred. "Mr. Cain," she said, settling onto the log beside him, while her team processed evidence and secured prisoners, "we need to talk about what you've discovered and why certain people are willing to kill to keep it buried." "I'm still trying to figure that out myself," Jed replied honestly. 3 days ago, I thought I'd inherited worthless land. Now I'm sitting in the middle of what looks like a federal operation." Agent Chen smiled grimly. 3 days ago, we thought we were investigating a relatively simple case of genealogical fraud. A man named David Kellerman had been running a scam, taking money from people researching their family histories and providing false information to keep them paying for months. But when we started tracking his activities, we found something much more interesting. She pulled out a tablet and showed him a map marked with red dots. These represent all the genealogical inquiries Kellerman had been monitoring over the past year. Notice anything? Jed studied the map and saw the pattern immediately. They're all concentrated in Montana Territory, specifically in areas where territorial officials operated between 1870 and 1880. Exactly. Kellerman wasn't just running a simple fraud scheme. He was acting as an early warning system for someone who wanted to know if anyone was getting close to discovering certain historical information. Martha and Robert joined them, both looking shaken by the morning's violence, but determined to understand what they'd stumbled into. "Agent Chen," Martha said, "how long have you been investigating this?" "The FBI opened a file on unusual genealogical activity 6 months ago, after the National Archives reported suspicious patterns in requests for territorial documents. But we didn't understand the scope of what we were dealing with until yesterday, when your inquiry to the state archives triggered multiple alerts in our monitoring systems. Robert looked confused. Multiple alerts. Your research request was immediately flagged by 3 different organizations: a private security firm in Denver, a law firm in Helena, and a family trust in California. All 3 had standing orders to be notified if anyone requested information about Clara Whitmore or the territorial gold theft of 1873. The implications were staggering. Not only had Clara's murder been covered up for 150 years, but multiple entities had been actively monitoring for anyone who might stumble onto the truth. Agent Chen continued, "What we've learned is that the stolen gold was just the beginning. The territorial officials who killed Clara used that gold to establish businesses and political connections that grew into considerable wealth and influence over the subsequent generations. Some of Montana's most prominent families trace their fortunes back to that theft, and they've been protecting the secret ever since," Jed concluded. "More than protecting it, they've been actively managing it. The genealogical monitoring, the document suppression, the deliberate misdirection of researchers like Mr. Whitmore, all of it coordinated to prevent anyone from discovering the truth about Clara's death and what it might reveal about their family origins." Martha had been studying Thomas's map while they talked, comparing it to the GPS coordinates where they'd been ambushed. "Agent Chen, we were still 3 miles from the location marked on this map when those men stopped us. If they were trying to prevent us from finding Clara's evidence cache, why didn't they wait until we actually reached it?" Agent Chen's expression grew troubled. "Because they weren't trying to stop you from finding the cache. They were trying to stop you from leading us to it. We've been tracking your movements since you left Mr. Cain's property this morning, and they knew it." The realization hit Jed like a physical blow. They wanted us to find it first. "Think about it from their perspective," Agent Chen explained. "They've known about this cache for generations, but they've never been able to access it without risking exposure. By letting you follow Thomas's map, they could learn the exact location while maintaining plausible deniability. Then they could eliminate the witnesses and retrieve whatever evidence Clara and Thomas hid there. But if you've been tracking us, why didn't you intervene earlier?" Robert asked. "Because we needed to identify all the players in this conspiracy. Until this morning, we didn't know how many people were involved or how far the cover-up extended. Now we have 3 men in custody who can provide testimony about who hired them and why." Agent Chen stood and looked toward the ridge that marked their original destination. "The question now is whether we continue following Thomas's map or whether we've learned enough to build a case without risking additional lives." Jed thought about Clara's photograph, the serious young woman who had died trying to expose the truth. After 150 years, she deserved better than having her story remain incomplete because modern law enforcement was worried about risk management. "Agent Chen," he said, "how many federal cases have you seen where the evidence was hidden by the victim before her murder and left specific instructions for someone to find it?" "None," she admitted. "Then I think we owe it to Clara to follow through. Besides, you said yourself that you need evidence to build a case against the people behind this conspiracy. If Thomas's map leads to proof that can expose 5 generations of cover-up and corruption, isn't that worth the risk?" Martha nodded agreement. "From a historical perspective, this could be one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in Montana's territorial history. The artifacts Clara and Thomas left behind could provide insight into territorial-era governance, criminal justice, and economic systems that we've never had access to before." Robert's voice carried the weight of 5 generations of family stories. When he spoke, "My great-great-grandmother Mary spent her entire life knowing that Clara had been murdered and that the killers had escaped justice. Every woman in my family since then has told Clara's story to their daughters, keeping her memory alive when the official record said she never existed." If there's evidence that can finally prove what happened to her, then we have an obligation to find it. Agent Chen studied all three of them, seeming to weigh their determination against the tactical challenges of the situation. Finally, she nodded. All right, but we do this my way. My team takes point, you three stay in the middle of the formation, and we assume that anyone we encounter out here is hostile until proven otherwise. She turned to address her team, coordinating equipment and communication protocols for the final push to Thomas's marked location. As the federal agents prepared for what could be a dangerous confrontation with more mercenaries or booby traps left by 19th century conspirators, Jed felt a mixture of anticipation and dread that reminded him of his early days as a forest ranger, when every call into the wilderness might reveal beauty or danger. In equal measure, Boone padded over and pressed against his leg. The dog's steady presence a reminder that some loyalties transcended the complications of human ambition and greed. Whatever they found at the end of Thomas's map, whatever secrets Clara had died trying to preserve, they would face it together. The morning sun was now high enough to burn away the last of the mist, revealing the mountain landscape in sharp detail. Somewhere ahead, in a cave or shelter that had kept its secrets for a century and a half, waited the evidence that could finally bring justice to a young woman who had been murdered for refusing to remain silent about corruption. As they began the final leg of their journey, Jed couldn't shake the feeling that Clara Whitmore was somehow watching, waiting to see if the truth she had died protecting would finally set her free. The final mile of Thomas's map led them through terrain that seemed designed by nature to discourage visitors. They climbed over granite ledges that required careful hand and foot work, descended into ravines where century-old rock slides had created natural obstacles, and pushed through stands of lodgepole pine so dense that the FBI agents had to use machetes to clear a path. Agent Chen's team moved with professional competence, but Jed could see the strain of unfamiliar territory wearing on them. These were agents accustomed to urban investigations and courthouse testimony, not wilderness tracking and high-altitude hiking. Their body armor and communication equipment, essential for their safety, made them clumsy in terrain where Clara and Thomas had moved freely in 1873. According to the map, we should be close, Martha said, checking her GPS against Thomas's careful notations. The final landmark is described as Eagle's Nest Rock, overlooking the valley where spirits rest. Boone had been ranging ahead with increasing excitement, his behavior suggesting they were approaching something significant. Now the old hound stopped at the base of a towering granite formation that rose from the mountainside like a natural watchtower, its peak crowned with the massive stick construction that marked an active eagle's nest. "This has to be it," Robert said, studying the rock formation. "The view from up there would give you sightlines for miles in every direction, perfect for watching anyone approaching from the valley below." Agent Chen deployed her team in a defensive perimeter while she, Jed, Martha, and Robert climbed toward what Thomas had marked as the final destination. The ascent was treacherous, requiring them to follow narrow ledges and handholds that had been carved into the granite face, probably by Thomas himself in preparation for hiding Clara's evidence. Halfway up the rock face, they found what they were looking for: a narrow cave entrance hidden behind a screen of mountain juniper that had grown thick enough over 150 years to completely conceal the opening from casual observation. The opening was just large enough for a person to squeeze through, and cold air flowing from within suggested the cave extended deep into the mountainside. Agent Chen called down to her team for climbing equipment and portable lights, but Jed was already pushing through the juniper screen with the flashlight from his pack. After coming this far and risking this much, he wasn't going to wait for federal bureaucracy to dictate the pace of Clara's vindication. The cave opened into a natural chamber about the size of a small room, its walls bearing the tool marks where Thomas had expanded the space to accommodate what he planned to hide. The air was dry and cold, with the mineral smell of deep rock and undisturbed time. But it was what occupied the center of the chamber that made them all stop and stare in wonder. A wooden chest, similar in construction to the tin box, but much larger, sat on a platform of flat stones that had been carefully arranged to keep it elevated above the cave floor. Beside it, wrapped in what appeared to be multiple layers of oiled canvas, was a bundle about the size of a human body. "Clara," Robert whispered, and Jed knew he was right. Agent Chen had squeezed through the cave entrance behind them, her tactical light illuminating details that Jed's smaller flashlight had missed. The walls of the chamber were covered with writing, carved deep into the granite with the patient determination of someone who had plenty of time and a compelling need to record the truth. "Thomas Hartwell, July 20th, 1873, Agent Chen read from the wall nearest the entrance. "I have brought Clara to this place where her murderers cannot disturb her rest. What follows is the true account of her death and the evidence she died trying to preserve. May God forgive my cowardice in not protecting her, and may He guide whoever finds this record to see justice done at last." The carved text continued for several feet, covering Thomas's account of Clara's discovery of the gold theft, her decision to confront the territorial authorities, and the events that led to her murder. But it was the wooden chest that drew their immediate attention. The chest was secured with a more substantial lock than the tin box had been. But 150 years of mountain air had been no kinder to brass and iron than it had been to the simpler mechanism they'd encountered before. Agent Chen produced a multi-tool from her tactical vest and made quick work of the corroded metal dot inside the chest. Wrapped in layers of oiled cloth that had preserved them perfectly were documents that would rewrite Montana's territorial history. Federal transportation contracts bearing forged signatures, shipping manifests that showed gold being transported from government facilities to private buyers, correspondence between territorial officials and California gold merchants detailing the sale of stolen federal property, and most damning of all, a detailed confession signed by James Morrison himself, apparently written in a moment of conscience before he realized the full extent of what he'd become involved in. But there was something else in the chest that none of them had expected to find. A leather-bound journal in Clara's own handwriting, documenting everything she had discovered about the conspiracy and everyone she believed to be involved. Clara, S journal, was a revelation that transformed their understanding of everything that had happened in July 1873. Written in the careful script of an educated woman, her entries chronicled not just the discovery of the gold theft, but a systematic investigation that would have impressed modern law enforcement. "June 15th, 1873, Agent Chen read aloud by flashlight, while Martha documented each page with her camera. "I have confirmed that the federal gold shipments are being intercepted at Morrison's warehouse in Virginia City. The legitimate cargo continues to Helena, but approximately half the gold is diverted to buyers in California. The operation involves at least 6 territorial officials and has been ongoing for more than 2 years. Clara had been far more than an accidental witness to corruption. She had been an investigator in her own right, methodically documenting evidence and building a case that could have brought down the entire territorial administration." June 28th. 1873, the journal continued. "I have spoken with Sarah Mackenzie, whose husband died in a mining accident that Morrison claimed was unavoidable. She believes Jacob was murdered because he discovered the gold theft and threatened to report it to federal authorities. I am now convinced that Morrison and his associates have killed at least 3 men to protect their secret." Robert's voice was tight with emotion as he listened to his ancestors' investigation unfold. Clara hadn't just stumbled onto evidence of theft. She had uncovered a pattern of murder that had been hidden for generations. July 5th, 1873. "I have tried to convince Silas to help me report what I have discovered, but he believes I am placing our family in unnecessary danger. He argues that territorial corruption is not our concern, and that we should focus on building our own lives rather than pursuing justice for strangers. I fear my husband's caution may be greater than his courage, but I cannot remain silent while innocent people die to protect guilty ones. The final entries were dated just days before Clara's death, and they revealed the extent of her courage and the tragedy of her isolation. On July 12, 1873, Thomas has agreed to help me document the location where the stolen gold is being stored before shipment to California. We will make a map together so that if anything happens to me, the evidence can still be found. Thomas believes, I'm being watched, and I fear he may be right. Morrison has been asking questions in town about my activities, and I have noticed strangers observing our homestead. On July 15, 1873, my final entry, should this journal survive what I do not. Tonight, I confront Morrison directly, demanding that he cease the theft and turn himself in to federal authorities. I carry with me copies of all the evidence I have gathered, believing that even a corrupt man might choose confession over continued crime when faced with proof of his guilt. Thomas has hidden the originals in a place where Morrison cannot find them, along with this journal and his own account of what we discovered. If I do not return home tonight, may someone with more courage than my husband find this record and see justice done at last. Agent Chen closed the journal carefully, her professional composure unable to hide the emotion in her voice. She went to confront Morrison alone, knowing she might not survive because she believed it was the right thing to do. The carved text on the cave walls filled in the rest of the story. Thomas had waited for Clara to return from her meeting with Morrison, and when she didn't come home by dawn, he had gone looking for her. He found her body in Morrison's warehouse, bearing signs of violence that made it clear she had been murdered when Morrison realized she couldn't be bought or intimidated into silence. Thomas had managed to retrieve Clara's body before Morrison's. Men could dispose of it, bringing her to this remote cave where he prepared her for burial according to the customs of their faith. But he had also preserved her investigation, creating a record that would survive long after the territorial officials responsible for her death had been forgotten by history. The sound of voices outside the cave interrupted their examination. Of the evidence, Agent Chen immediately drew her sidearm and motioned for the others to remain silent while she moved to the cave entrance. Agent Chen! The voice belonged to one of her team members, but it carried a note of urgency that suggested new complications. We've got movement on multiple ridges. Looks like a coordinated approach. At least a dozen individuals moving toward our position. Agent Chen cursed under her breath. Despite capturing the mercenaries who had ambushed them earlier, the conspiracy apparently had additional resources and wasn't prepared to let Clara's evidence see the light of day. How long do we have? She called back. Maybe 20 minutes if they're moving carefully, less if they decide to rush us. Agent Chen turned back to Jed, Martha, and Robert. We need to get this evidence out of here now. Can you carry the chest between you? What about Clara? Robert asked, looking toward the canvas-wrapped remains of his ancestor. She's waited 150 years for justice, Agent Chen replied grimly. I think she'd understand that getting her evidence to safety is more important than moving her remains right now. Outside the cave, Boone began barking with the particular intensity that meant he had detected multiple threats approaching from different directions. The final confrontation was about to begin. 6 months later, Jed stood in the same clearing, where his journey had begun, watching as a team of archaeologists and forensic specialists carefully excavated the foundation of his great-great-grandfather's original cabin. The investigation that had started with Boone digging up a tin box had grown into one of the most significant historical discoveries in Montana's territorial period. Clara Whitmore Cain had been laid to rest in the Missoula City Cemetery with full honors. her grave marked by a headstone that read, "Beloved wife, mother and seeker of justice, 1,850 to 1,873 inches." The ceremony had been attended by hundreds of people, including descendants of families whose names appeared in her journal as victims of the territorial conspiracy. Robert Whitmore had spoken at the service, reading from his great-great-grandmother Mary's letters and sharing the family stories that had kept Clara's memory alive through 5 generations. His voice had been steady and proud as he described a woman who had died rather than remain silent about corruption and murder. The legal aftermath had been complex but satisfying. While no one could be prosecuted for Clara's murder after 150 years, the federal investigation had uncovered modern crimes connected to the cover-up. 3 prominent Montana families had been forced to repay millions of dollars to federal accounts, money traced directly to the territorial gold theft. The genealogical monitoring system had been dismantled, and several individuals had been charged with conspiracy to obstruct justice. Martha Thornfield had been appointed to lead a new historical commission dedicated to investigating and correcting territorial-era record falsification. Her first major project was a comprehensive documentation of Clara's investigation, which had revealed at least 6 additional murders connected to the Morrison conspiracy. The Commission's work would ensure that other victims like Clara would not remain forgotten by history. But for Jed, the most meaningful change had been personal. He had decided not to sell his inherited property. Instead, he had restored the old homestead and built a small research center where historians and genealogists could access the archives that Clara's case had brought to light. The treehouse had been carefully preserved as a historical landmark, and visitors often commented on the peaceful atmosphere of the clearing where a young woman's courage had finally been vindicated. Boone had adapted well to their new life. The old hound spent his days exploring the mountain trails and his evenings by the fireplace in the restored cabin, seemingly content with the knowledge that his digging had uncovered more than anyone could have imagined. This morning, as autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Jed was expecting visitors. A documentary crew was coming to film the final segments of a program about Clara's case, and Martha had arranged for several historians to provide expert commentary on the territorial period corruption that Clara had exposed. But before the cameras arrived, Jed wanted a few minutes alone in the place where it all began. He walked to the hickory tree and looked up at the weathered tree house, now stabilized and protected by a preservation order from the State Historical Society. The structure looked exactly as it had 6 months ago, but Jed's perspective had changed completely. What had once seemed like a worthless relic now represented something profound about the connection between past and present, about the way truth has a tendency to surface no matter how deeply it's buried. Agent Chen had visited the previous week to provide an update on the ongoing federal investigation. The conspiracy to hide Clara's murder had involved more people and lasted longer than anyone had initially suspected. Some of Montana's most respected families had been quietly paying for genealogical monitoring and document suppression for decades, terrified that someone would eventually follow the trail back to their ancestors' crimes. The remarkable thing, Agent Chen had told him, is that Clara's investigation was so thorough that it's still providing leads for modern cases. Her documentation of territorial corruption patterns has helped us identify similar schemes in other states that we never would have connected otherwise. Now, as Jed sat in the folding chair where he'd first opened Clara's tin box, he reflected on the strange way that time could compress when truth finally emerged. Clara Whitmore had been dead for 150 years, but her courage and determination felt as present and real as if she had been standing beside him in the morning sunlight. Boone approached from his patrol of the property perimeter, tail wagging with the satisfaction of a job well done. The old hound settled at Jed's feet with the contented sigh of an animal who had found his purpose and seen it through to completion. In the distance, Jed could hear vehicles approaching along the mountain road. The documentary crew, the historians, the modern world arriving to examine and celebrate a story that had waited patiently for the right moment to be told. But for now, in the quiet morning air of the Montana mountains, Jed simply sat and enjoyed the peaceful knowledge that sometimes, if you're patient enough and loyal enough, the truth finds a way to set everyone free. Clara Whitmore Cain could rest easy at. Thus, her story would not be forgotten again. The mountains held their secrets still, but they no longer held hers.